there are two founding fathers, and the first of those chronologically, I suppose, is De Valera, who ends up on the losing side of the Civil War, is cast into the wilderness for a few years, and then comes back into power in 32, and then comes to dominate the southern state for the next 40 years or so, to some extent, as Taoiseach and Prime Minister, that is to say, and also President. And the other founding father was Collins, who was the founding father and the fallen hero, who overshadowed the 1920s to some extent. Now, with the advent of De Valera and the Fianna Fáil party in 32, Collins' star began to fall. And then for reasons connected to a sort of reaction to republicanism of the Fianna Fáil De Valera type, Collins came very much back into the fore in the 1990s.
So, like, I mean, when you were doing your own research, I mean, how did you find this Collins character? I mean, did you feel bad for him? Did you feel like he's a fallen hero, or like kind of,
No, I mean, Collins was, as you would expect, remarkable. And revolutions have the habit of throwing up remarkably able people from maybe not necessarily the most privileged backgrounds. Napoleon Bonaparte being the classic example. He was a minor aristocrat, and but revolution propelled him to the very top. And Collins was a post office worker, a minor civil servant, but a man of tremendous energy and great ability. And so that energy and drive saw him in the post-1916 period achieve senior positions within the IRA, eventually becoming the Director of Intelligence within the IRA and the Minister for Finance inside of the Dáil government, the Republican Dáil government. He was, like many people who are driven, innately political, innately ambitious, aggressive, not to say violent. And when he acquired power, he held on to it. So he was an extraordinary person in the sense that, he was very senior in the army, where he held a key position as the intelligence supremo. He held a key position in government as Minister for Finance, very able. He'd been an accountant briefly. And he was also climbing up through that shadowy organization, the IRB, which was a secret oath-bound society that, in a sense, controlled or influenced all aspects of the revolutionary movement, steering it towards a Republican position. Because Sinn Féin represented a broad church, monarchists and Republicans, and all sorts of shades of influence and identity in between those polarities. So he works his way to a position, and he's sent to London to negotiate the treaty in the autumn of 1921. And for my money, his decision to acquiesce to the British settlement was key in influencing the delegates that were over there, the plenipotentiaries as they were called, key in influencing the IRB, key in influencing the government at home. So he at that moment he plays an absolutely pivotal piece on the chessboard, as it were, because he's a hardline Republican. He's IRB, which would be known to the inner circle of people. He's military. He's army, and he's made a disproportionate contribution to winning the war against the British, because what the IRA get right in 1919, 20, and 21 is that they're able to fight a very effective intelligence war. The British never really get on top of the intelligence war in Ireland. Had it been a longer war, I think the outcome in terms of intelligence would have been different. But Collins is able to make preemptive strikes. He's utterly ruthless when he identifies spies, networks, and he eliminates them. So the British lose the intelligence war, as far as we can tell at the moment, at least. That's what it looks like. And so Collins plays an absolutely key role in that. In signing the treaty in London, he helps affect the division within the nationalist movement. And as I've said earlier, this leads to civil war in the summer. He emerges in the early part of the Civil War as the leader of the government, the leader of the army, the leader of the IRB. So he's all controlling. He fights the war it's kind of what you might call a phony war in the early weeks. And that's, not to disrespect anyone that died in that period, but a lot of senior people were captured by the pro-treaty, pro-state people, Collins's people, and they're released. Ordinary IRA men opposing the treaty, fighting against Collins, are captured, their guns are taken off them, they're sent home. My own thinking about this is what Collins was aiming for was a short civil war. Now remember, he's backed by the British, so he has enormous resource behind him. He can raise an army, he can put it in uniform, he can arm it, and he can go to battle with some force. Now, the odds in the early weeks are balanced, but in a longer struggle, they're in favor of Collins. And it looks as if, to me, that he was hoping that the IRA would come to their senses and work out that even if they beat Collins, they'd still have to fight the British Empire beyond the pro-treaty army. And that was, to him, irrational. So he goes to Cork on a tour of inspection in mid-August, by which stage the IRA have been driven from, the anti-treaty IRA have been driven from every town of any size, really, bar very few in remote Kerry and West Cork. For them, he assumes the war is over, and he drives around Cork, almost assuming that the war is over, that he's victorious. He goes to visit his home place. He sees his cousins, his family. He has a small escort, an armored car. He's in a touring car, a motorcycle outrider, and he's caught in an ambush. And he's the only fatality in the ambush. He dies in rather stupid circumstances, actually, trying to prove his bravery, because he'd been a desk soldier throughout the war, and this was probably his first real engagement in a live action situation since 1916. And he is shot through the head and killed, the only fatality in the ambush. It's a remarkable event in it's kind of such an unnecessary death. Had he been better looked after, had he taken evasive action, had he not stood up at the end of the ambush on the side of the road and he was reloading his rifle, he should have walked away from that situation. But it changes the whole game inevitably when a leader like that is removed. And the government respond immediately, in the sense that they undo some of his policies. So he had suspended Parliament from the beginning of the Civil War, so he wasn't accountable to any legislative body or assembly. And almost within hours of his death, they made a decision to call Parliament together, and they start back on a path that looks like a much more constitutional path than the one that Collins was following hitherto. And what emerges from that is, yes, a trajectory leading to what eventually becomes a democratic state.